Well, parliamentary colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Speaker's House, and a particularly warm welcome to Margaret Beckett, Dame Margaret Beckett, and Leo, who is with her this evening. It's our pleasure and privilege to have you with us, and in a few moments, a particular pleasure for us to hear from Margaret. Now, of course, as is characteristic on these occasions, there are many people in the room who've got long and rich memories of working alongside Margaret because they've served in Parliament with her, and there are others who are more recent entrants. Still others are present who work either with members or in the service of the House, who, alternatively, there are people here who are what I would call friends of the House, who are not members and never have been members, but have got a great interest in politics, and in particular in lectures about people. So I hope you're going richly to enjoy what you're about to hear. Margaret Beckett has got a parliamentary career so far, I think she's probably at the midpoint now, of nearly 40 years, I think 38 years if my arithmetic is correct, coming into Parliament as Labour Member of Parliament for Lincoln in October 1974 and continuing until 1979. She came back into the House in Derby South in 1983, to which I think at one point there was a minor boundary change, but essentially the Derby South constituency is what Margaret has represented here in the House over the last 33 years, and she has got, by any standards or yardstick, a staggering track record of parliamentary and governmental service in this place, and a lot of memories and huge knowledge and wisdom, which I think we all respect. I won't canter through her various shadow roles, but that front bench component of her career is, I think, of the order of 30 years or thereabouts. So it's very similar to that, for example, of Jack Straw, and it's a very impressive testament to her ability, to how she's been valued by successive leaders of her party, and to her sense of public service. As far as government is concerned, there's a lot. But before we even get to the question of government, Margaret, of course, served as deputy leader of her party from 1992 to 1994 under John Smith, just after Neil Kinnock had left the leadership. And, of course, Margaret was acting leader of the Labour Party during that really tragic interregnum, I think I would describe it, when John Smith so prematurely left us. And from my point of view, I came in 97, and so I know Margaret as somebody who served in government, not as in the 70s, I think, as a junior minister, but at the highest level. First as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, thereafter as leader of the House, in which capacity Margaret won genuinely rave reviews from across the House. I remember one day at Business Questions when Julian Lewis, Desmond Swain and I all got up to pay tribute to her. At the time there was some particularly absurd rumour that she might be about to be moved, whereupon I think Margaret said, "I'm starting to suspect that these rather gracious remarks about my efforts as leader of the House are really a ruse to persuade me to allow time for a debate on whatever the honourable member has in mind at the time." But she really was a terrific and highly effective and respected leader of the House. She then went to become Secretary of State for DEFRA, for the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and proceeded to that great office of Foreign Secretary. So those are the highlights, and they're very real highlights of Margaret's career to date. As I referenced, she certainly came to know, to work closely with, and I rather imagine greatly to admire, John Smith. And it is on the subject of John Smith that you've assembled in large and expectant numbers tonight. And I would invite everybody here present, please, to give Margaret Beckett a hugely warm and enthusiastic welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very mindful that in this audience there'll be those who knew John well, perhaps better than I did, along with people who never met him and who know of him only by repute. And if I can, I want to try and give those latter colleagues in particular a flavour of what he was like. So let me begin by describing him. He was of medium height, somewhat stocky, especially when he'd been escaping the supervision of his family, his staff, or his PPS, Hilary Armstrong. It wasn't totally unknown, after Hilary had put him into his car to go home, for him to sneak out to the bar or smoking room for a wee dram with some of his many friends. Hilary was, of course, later the chief whip, but I've often wondered whether she didn't find being responsible for looking after John as much trouble as the rest of the PLP put together. He had great energy and determination. Simon Hoggo once described him steaming down the committee corridor like a small rhinoceros, which I think those of us who know him might find somewhat evocative. It was the conventional wisdom that he looked like the ideal bank manager, someone who might be friendly, not unsympathetic, and would provide absolutely sound advice on which you could safely rely. By the time he became more widely known in public life, he was a highly regarded and successful barrister, and I think many pigeonholed him as a smart Edinburgh barrister who looked like a bank manager, sound, if perhaps a little dull. I should say at once that any such perception would be more than a little misleading. Not long before he died, I saw a photograph of him as a small boy, a photograph that I described as a Just William sort of picture. He had a wicked grin from ear to ear, his tie was round his ear, and the text accompanying the picture mentioned that his shirt tails were always hanging out. Colleagues who spent time in John's company would have had no difficulty detecting that small boy in the statesman and leader. But John was a Highlander and took great pride in being so. His first schooling was in Ardrishaig in Argyll, where his father was the head teacher of the village school. And much was expected of the head teacher's son. He's heard in later years to say that he was expected to get everything right, and soon learnt it was easier to do so. A passion for accuracy was something he retained throughout his life, and I shudder to think what he'd make of so-called post-truth politics. Senior schooling meant going to Dunoon and lodging there. Although called Dunoon Grammar School, the school was in fact a comprehensive, and John was always proud that he, like his daughters, had had a good comprehensive education. He went to university in Glasgow, where he met Elizabeth and where he made many of the friends who surrounded him for the rest of his life, friends like Derry Irvine and Donald Dewar, brilliant barristers, brilliant debaters. He loved a good gossip, and he had a strong sense of mischief, often deployed in the chamber to the disadvantage of political opponents. He was a very convivial companion, and it was his old friend Donald Dewar who said at his funeral, John would start a party in an empty room and frequently did. He was a man at ease in any company. And he had another quality, so unusual in my experience as to be almost unique. He had a calm, serene, almost untroubled self-confidence. He wasn't arrogant, he wasn't cocky or conceited, he just knew what he could do. Unlike many other politicians, he was never looking over his shoulder at the competition. He wasn't worried. He enjoyed and celebrated the achievements of others without worrying they might eclipse him and without jealousy. Although ultimately he became a successful barrister, John didn't at first have the family money to go to the bar. He had to begin as a solicitor, and I'm indebted to Tam Diell's lovely obituary of John for the information that he raised the cash by betting successfully against Labour winning the constituency of North Ayrshire and Bute in the 1964 general election. His political judgment of the likely outcome was better than that of the bookies. He had a distinctly frivolous side. He told me that his daughters, to whom he was a devoted father, competed to see who could get him to wear the most outrageous and unsuitable ties. And he was very proud to be a trades unionist, a long-standing member of the GMB from the time when they were just the Boilermakers trade union, making him, as he said, one of only 2 Boilermakers in the House of Commons. The other, by the way, was Gerald Kaufman. A member of the right wing of the PLP of the day, he was always, I thought, a socialist, driven to be so by his values and by his strong faith. I imagine he could have made a great deal of money at the bar, but his natural egalitarianism, his compassion, his experience of life, especially since he joined the Labour Party at the age of 16, and his sense of public service and public duty brought him into politics, which he regarded as a wholly honourable public service. His maiden speech paid tribute, as usual, to his predecessor, but ignoring the convention that such speeches might be non-controversial, he then attacked the government of the day for the inadequacy of the provision they were making, particularly for the least well-off. He was always intensely conscious of the very real difficulties experienced by his constituents. I remember him saying that if only his poorest constituents had access to even a small sum of capital, a small amount of savings, their lives would be completely transformed. And I always thought that was probably one of the ideas behind Gordon Brown's proposal for child trust funds. John had eloquence and wit, as well as passion for the less fortunate, and his talents inevitably began to be recognised and acknowledged. But he was prepared from his very early career to do what he believed to be right, whether or not it would be popular with the party hierarchy. Having been elected in 1970, only a year or so later, he was one of a group of passionate Labour pro-Europeans who, believing this to be right for Britain's future, voted against a 3-line whip in favour of Ted Heath's bill to take Britain into the then European community. He said, and I quote, "I'm willing to give up some national sovereignty to gain a sovereignty which will be able to do something about controlling the international companies of the future." And he asserted that if we didn't enter Europe, we would be unable to control them, and again I quote, "and achieve the economic, social and political ends which are our main political objectives." Nor was this the only early risk he took in conventional career terms. When Labour returned to power in February 1974, he was offered a ministerial post as one of the Scottish law officers, Solicitor General for Scotland. He turned it down, fearing that he'd be trapped and typecast as a Scottish office minister or one of the law officers, rather than being in the mainstream of political life. That was a dangerous gamble, but it paid off. By October 1974, after the second election of that year, he was made a parliamentary secretary in the Department of Energy, where he took through the Commons the bill to set up the British National Oil Corporation and secure for the state the reserves of North Sea oil and gas, and with them the enormous revenues which later accrued, ironically, and I would say disastrously, to the governments of Margaret Thatcher. All his political life, John raged at the betrayal of Britain's long-term economic and social interests in the frittering away of those vast windfall revenues for which neither Margaret Thatcher nor her chancellors has ever been held to account. Although an unashamed right-winger, John had no difficulty in getting on at Energy with Tony Benn, for whose abilities as a departmental head he had a great deal of respect. In fact, it seems it was to Tony's recommendation he owed his early promotion to Minister of State. And his ability to get on with everyone, whatever the shade of their opinions, was one of John's abiding characteristics, as Dennis Skinner, among others, testified after his death. "I come," Dennis said, "from a different wing of the party, yet we never had words in anger. We were able to remain friends." In 1976, after Jim Callaghan succeeded Harold Wilson as Prime Minister, and to Tony Benn's expressed regret, John was moved to the Cabinet Office under Michael Foot, to turn his talents and skills to the thorny issue of devolution. He was, as Tony said, on the way up. Certainly, this was the kind of job where John's particular personal skills would be invaluable. Not only egalitarian, he was non-hierarchical in his attitudes, willing, even eager, to hear everyone's point of view and open-minded about taking on board what he heard. As a young man, he'd been a skeptic on the issue, but by this time he'd become convinced of the merits and necessity of taking action, which he believed to be in the interests of the UK as a whole, not just of Scotland. But it's probably wise to recall that he remained utterly opposed to the breakup of the Union with Scotland, which he suggested would be a spectacular folly. The legislation was complex and difficult to handle, and the Labour Party was by no means united on the issues. From the early stages of the legislation, the government was forced to make unwelcome concessions, including agreeing to a post-bill referendum. And after a long and tortuous passage through Parliament, the bill passed, only to be derailed by the need for a qualifying majority in that referendum. But although at that time the devolution project failed, John emerged with his personal and parliamentary reputation much enhanced due to his handling of what was recognised to have been a hospital pass or a poisoned chalice. And to quote Dennis Skinner again, he was a person who could operate in this place. He knew its moods. Sometimes it's like a church, and on other occasions, it's like a zoo. He was promoted to the Department of Trade and Industry, the youngest member of the cabinet, but in a government reaching the end of its lifespan, as it shortly did. John disliked being in opposition intensely. His view was, and I quote, "You don't go into politics to be in opposition. Where's the sense in that?" He told a reporter, "I want power for the satisfaction of using it for a proper purpose. I'm frustrated in opposition." He took the opportunity to return to the bar, generally during recesses, supplementing his income and ultimately earning his legal spurs as a Queen's Counsel. Those such as Ming Campbell, who followed his legal progress, identified characteristics in his approach which were evident throughout his political career. He showed a forensic ability to identify the best point in his own case and pursue it, and an equal ability to identify and pursue mercilessly the weakest points in an opponent's case. Mercilessly, but without malice, and deploying those gifts of wit and humour. I said earlier John was on the right of the party, and when in 1981 some of those who, like John, had defied the whip on joining the European Community left our party to set up the SDP, some may have thought John would go with them. Everyone who knew John is clear that that was never going to happen. Elizabeth said that, and I quote, "It simply never occurred to him because he had a deep commitment to the things Labour stands for." Ming Campbell said John would have fought to the death for his Labour Party membership card. He had a deep tribal loyalty to the party, despite being at the time understandably depressed about its prospects. Certainly, speaking of that time, he once said to me that he would never have joined another party, that if for whatever reason he felt he could no longer remain in it, he would simply and quietly walk away, that he would never do the Labour Party any harm. He said once of the defectors, "I'm comfortable with the unions. They aren't. That's the big difference. Over the following opposition years, he was consistently elected year on year to the shadow cabinet, and during that period he had a spad at one time called Vince Cable. John Reed, who was in Neil Kinnock's office, has recalled in 1983 John lobbying to be Shadow Secretary of State for Employment with the words, "Tell Neil Tebbit is a bastard and tell him I'm a bigger bastard." In 1984, he moved back to shadow industry, and it was in this period that he began to attain greater public prominence to match his Commons reputation. The Westland affair, which, for those who've forgotten, turned on the future of the company Westland Helicopters and whether a European or American solution should be pursued, a matter which led Michael Heseltine to resign as Secretary of State for Defence and came close to toppling Margaret Thatcher. Her Secretary of State, Leon Britton, was widely thought to have been perhaps economical with the truth in his statement to the House, and Mrs. Thatcher had been sitting at his side throughout. So there were huge rows and problems, and the whole culminated in Leon Britton's resignation. John's greatly increased media exposure and the general view that he had handled himself exceptionally well on this and other industrial issues markedly improved his standing with the media, with the party, and with the public, and led to his appointment after the 1987 general election to the post of Shadow Chancellor. However, it was while shadowing industry that he seems first to have identified a theme he pursued vigorously for the rest of his life, and which has pervaded Labour's approach to economic policy ever since, though John is rarely given the credit for that. It's easy now to forget what was then the conventional wisdom of the day. Economic success and social justice were seen as conflicting aims. It was regarded as a matter of choice, perhaps even stark choice. The pursuit of one was necessarily assumed to involve a sacrifice of the other. These then fairly universal assumptions were beginning to be challenged in political discussion and debate, and it was a challenge John took up with gusto, arguing fervently that far from one having to be sacrificed to pursue the other, the pursuit of prosperity and social justice went hand in hand and could even be mutually reinforcing. In the John Mackintosh Memorial Lecture in 1987, he set out his view that government should promote and support growth by investing in education and training, research and development, and regional industrial policy that drew in both public and private sectors, all of which, I would argue, is today's conventional wisdom. Up to this point, I had, of course, been aware of John as a colleague and shared the widespread appreciation of his talents, but I didn't know him at all well. Following the loss of the 1987 general election, Neil Kinnock took a dramatic, daring, and then unprecedented step, especially in our tradition-loving party. He set up a year zero review of all Labour's then policies and commitments. He drove home the realisation that whatever the day-to-day problems that had to be managed in the House of Commons in the early 90s, the next government would have to address the issues of the late 90s and beyond. It may seem obvious now, but it was a completely new approach, unprecedented then not just for Labour, but for any British political party. And the 1987 election was notable for a new ruthlessness in the Tory campaign. They'd always made sweeping and ill-founded allegations of Labour profligacy, coupled with even more ill-founded allegations of inevitable and massive increases in taxation. But in 1987, they'd made a collection not just of every agreed policy proposal, fair enough, but of every loosely worded remark, every kite-flying Fabian pamphlet, every enthusiastic speech by an ambitious young frontbencher, anything and everything that might ever have been floated as a policy idea. They got civil servants to cost them all and asserted that on civil service figures, Labour had promised to spend something like £35 billion and that we would put up income tax by 10 pence in the pound to pay for it. Against this background, it was decided we had to deal, and deal thoroughly, with a campaign which was in danger of making us unelectable. And one of the policy groups that was set up on economic and social policy was chaired by John Smith. And as the junior frontbencher shadowing social security policy, I was one of that group. It was the first time I'd worked closely with John. The impact of his egalitarianism and his open-mindedness speedily became evident. And Emma McLennan, then a policy officer at headquarters, well remembers her first encounter with him. She told me, we were walking across Westminster Hall, and he said he'd had an idea about pensions that he wanted to run by me. And she responded enthusiastically. She thought it was a really great idea. He stopped in his tracks. He swung round and he said, never do that again. I want to hear what the problems are. I want you to think about the downsides. I don't want to hear the downside in the chamber. And in the policy group, he was the same. He wanted to know what everyone thought, even the most junior in the room. And Emma recalls one idea being abandoned when cogent objections were raised by an LSE student on an internship. We certainly needed all the input, critical and otherwise, that we could get. Although it was year zero, there were some inherited commitments it was impossible to abandon. A pension increase of £5 a week for a single person, £8 for a married couple, and a £3 increase in child benefit. Those pledges had been made in a more carefree time. In fact, in the early days of the policy group's work, when Nigel Lawson was boasting about Britain's economic miracle having succeeded and superseded Germany's, when he was using North Sea oil revenues to cut income tax and pension contributions, we were struggling to persuade colleagues that even more generous pledges might be difficult to afford. And once Lawson's hubris had been followed by nemesis, one of our biggest problems was and remained how to finance those commitments when the economy had fallen off a cliff. It was in this period when John had a major heart attack. He told me once that it's a common experience at such a time for an amazing feeling of euphoria and triumph swiftly to be followed by a period of deep depression as the nearness of averted death sinks in. He was deeply and abidingly grateful to those who'd shared that experience and wrote in great numbers to warn him what to expect and tell him it would pass. And he made a point of doing the same himself, writing in the same vein, for example, to Michael Heseltine when he had a similar experience. John made quite a swift recovery, taking up climbing the Scots Peaks, the Munros, and he took over again from Gordon Brown, who'd stood in for him. Typically, he was pleased that Gordon was felt to have done well, without feeling the slightest bit threatened by it. It was about this time I was elected to join the shadow cabinet, and John and Neil both told me of their subsequent conversation. Neil asked John who he wanted to take over from Gordon as Shadow Chief Secretary, the enforcer of financial discipline. John said, I want Margaret Beckett. And he told me that Neil burst into a great grin and said, man, you're a professional. That's exactly what I was going to suggest. It may seem odd now, but the idea of having someone from the left of the party in such a role and working with an acknowledged right-winger was thought extraordinary. John was characteristically unworried. John Eatwell, Neil's main economic advisor, called us together with Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, Shadow Industry, Shadow Employment, and announced that we four were to be branded as Labour's economic team, or as John Prescott called us, the beautiful people, which I pointed out to him was quite erroneous on my part, to travel the country together, to do joint press conferences, followed by individual programmes, and then regroup and return to base. And for the rest of the run-up to the 92 election, that's what we did, embarking, not least, on what became known as the prawn cocktail circuit. In other words, rather than shunning private sector players, we sought and accepted contacts, as Labour supporters in the business community had long urged. It meant that we heard directly from the business community of their main concerns, and that they heard of our ideas and approach from us, neither being filtered through the Conservative Party as so often in the past. Nor did we only pursue this path within the UK. Britain was due to assume the EU presidency early in the next Parliament, and John and I travelled to Paris and to Brussels with our advisers to forge closer ties with potential EU partners, which we did so successfully that many of them came to John's funeral. And along with Tony as Shadow Employment Secretary, we made a similar trip to Germany. Everywhere we were met with friendly interest and cooperation. And I remember John saying over dinner with our then ambassador to the EU that if the Berlin Wall can fall, the common agricultural policy can be reformed. Something I quoted to my German colleague when I was negotiating major cap reform at DEFRA. She was thrilled and said, "Can I use it?" As Shadow Chancellor, John was both a formidable opponent in the House of Commons and an advocate for the less fortunate. It shouldn't be forgotten at a time when the national minimum wage is so accepted that John Smith was the very first Shadow Chancellor to accept the case for a national minimum wage. And that was not, by the way, in any way a foregone conclusion. He had to take on and defeat substantial, continued opposition from within the trade union movement. As Shadow Chancellor, John increasingly dominated the Chamber of the Commons. It's probably impossible to convey to those who didn't hear it the impact of some of his key speeches at the time. On the way in, someone mentioned to me a speech he made about a country in which the Grand National didn't run and hotels fall into the sea, which probably doesn't convey to those who didn't see those newsreels the impact. But along with serious economic analysis and counter-proposals were the kind of memorable touches that unsettle a government and alarm its supporters. When it was common knowledge that Margaret Thatcher took more heed of her in-house advisers, Alan Walters and Brian Griffiths, than those of her Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, John sang to him across the dispatch box the theme from the then popular Australian soap Neighbours. It was cruelly appropriate. Neighbours, everybody needs good neighbours. Just a friendly wave each morning helps to make a better day. Neighbours need to get to know each other. Next door is only a footstep away. Neighbour, I haven't finished. You've got both verses. Neighbours, everybody needs good neighbours. With a little understanding, you can find a perfect blend. Neighbours should be there for one another. That's when good neighbours become good friends. It brought the house down. And very shortly afterwards, Nigel Lawson with it. He was succeeded by John Major, as very soon was Margaret Thatcher herself. And over that whole period, John was, as I say, a formidable opponent in the House. We only ever had one real row, and it was about something which may seem quite ridiculous, the public sector borrowing requirement. John thought it was time to take a chance and soften our stance on it, and I thought that we were risking throwing away a reputation that we had built up with great difficulty. I have a vivid memory of the economic advisors sitting around the table, as quiet as mice, while we shouted at one another. And we went home, and I worried about it, tossed and turned. And I came in the morning and I said, I've been thinking about it all night and I've decided you're right. And he said, I've been thinking about it all night and I've decided you're right. So we sorted it out. And in 1992, it became clear John Major might go to the country straight after budget proposals. A year or so earlier, there'd been a sustained and hard-fought battle in the Shadow Cabinet Economic Committee about our proposed alternatives to the by then wildly unpopular poll tax. Some colleagues wanted to propose a radical and completely new system of local government taxation, but others of us feared this offered too much scope for misrepresentation. In the end, it was decided to propose reform of the rates. They were familiar to the public, and our excellent local government team were able to spell out what the new rates charge would then be in each area and get their figures validated and verified by independent audit bodies. And it worked like a charm. And increasingly, it seemed to John and I that the best answer to the usual lies about our tax plans would be to carry out a parallel exercise on the budget. We assembled a brilliant team of sworn to secrecy, number crunchers and experts, all volunteers. And in the few days immediately after the budget, they worked night and day using Norman Lamont's own figures for available resources and our proposed changes, and to draw up alternative, detailed proposals, setting out tax bands and net impacts for the usual range of different income and family groups. We were able to show that the vast majority would be better off under our proposals, and the most vulnerable, the greatest beneficiaries, with only the top 16% making a higher net contribution. The launch of the shadow budget was a triumph. John looked and sounded like a chancellor. Our plans were obviously to the benefit of the vast majority of the population, and the assembled media clearly accepted that that was the case. Nor indeed could the Tories challenge our figures. I heard afterwards that after 4 days of the Treasury trying to find errors they could use to discredit us, their media advisers told them to forget the shadow budget and return to the unfounded and untruthful propaganda allegations on which they had already spent a fortune in advertising. And they did. The rest is history. Immediately after the election, Neil resigned, and it was clear John would run for the leadership. There were many, including long-standing and devoted members of the party, in their bitter disappointment, expressing freely the view that Labour could and would never again win another general election. We didn't share that view, but for the first time, Leo and I agreed that we could no longer afford the luxury of automatically supporting whoever was the candidate of the left. It had to be the best possible person, and it was clear that that was John. So I told him we would support him, although that very much upset some of our oldest and closest friends on the left of the party. And within a day or two, I heard a BBC report that John and I were running as a team for leader and deputy. I was appalled. I had not the slightest wish to be deputy leader, and I was concerned that John would have to work with whoever was elected, and it would be a bad start if they thought they were second choice. So I rang the BBC, told them it was completely untrue, and then my phone rang. And one of our colleagues said, I heard a story about you running for the deputy leadership. And I explained, yes, I heard that too. What I want to know is, why not? That was the first of many such conversations, and by Monday morning I had reluctantly accepted what seemed to be inevitable. And just after we reached the office, John appeared. He said, I came to tell you that you've got to run, but I hear you've already decided to. And once elected, he told me he wanted me to handle all aspects of our campaigning and to be a real deputy. I wasn't really sure what that meant, but I soon found out. John had a very clear view and vision. The job of the leader was to set a clear direction and vision for the party, to concentrate on pursuing that and not allow himself to be diverted by any day-to-day trivia. So all the things, the routine-ish things that the leader always did, mostly I did. It was during this period the unifying benefits of John's approach to colleagues really came to the fore. He genuinely wanted, for example, to hear the views of all the shadow cabinet on policy. Genuine dialogue and debate without a preconceived conclusion were fostered, not interminably, but thoroughly. Clear and firm conclusions were reached, and decisions, once made, were adhered to. Reconsideration of a decision thrashed out and concluded was not impossible, but you proposed it at your peril. You had to be very sure of the necessity and very sure of your ground. And of course, with the advent of Black Wednesday and the catastrophic and expensive collapse of our membership of the ERM, with interest rates rising at one point to 15%, it had become clear that it was we and not the government who'd told the truth about the state of the economy. It was a collapse from which their economic reputation did not recover, and John was well placed to drive the lessons home, and did. Over the subsequent months, he also embarked on a substantial programme of change. Within the party, he proposed new structures, moving to a system of one member, one vote, rather than the block vote. He set up a commission for social justice, headed by the recently deceased Gordon Borry, to independently reassess the full scale and picture of the nation's social problems and how they might be tackled, as Beveridge had done earlier in that century. It was John who committed us to constitutional reforms, such as a Human Rights Act. Greater freedom of information. He wasn't an enthusiast. He was prepared to commit himself and the party to a referendum on the subject. And it was in this period that we saw the skillful handling of the Maastricht Treaty, where again he gave his head and gave his support to George Robertson and his team, who did an absolutely brilliant job, focusing what was again conflicting points of view around our support of the social chapter and the government's opposition to it, culminating in inflicting a defeat on the government on that issue, which they had to have a confidence vote to overcome. And not long before he died, John made two important speeches identifying what he saw as the way ahead. One was a speech called Reclaiming the Ground, in which he spoke of his sense of a moral purpose in politics and the need for an enabling state, linking it for himself to his faith. The second was addressed to the future of the European Union, which he pressed to become more outward-looking and more growth-oriented. Since his death, sometimes it's been tacitly suggested that John was a status quo man, content to wait for it to be Labour's turn to govern again. I think nothing could be further from the truth. Dennis Skinner, again, said he had dragged the Labour Party from the depths of despair to the pinnacles of power. In preparing for this speech, I had the opportunity to talk to a number of people who were close to John, and Elizabeth reminded me of the conclusion to the speech John made the night before he died. The opportunity to serve our country. That's all we ask. And I will recall another occasion when, in bewilderment as well as irritation, after some exchange across the dispatch box, he said, "What's the point of being in politics if it isn't to speak up for people who can't speak up for themselves?" And on the 20th anniversary of his death, the John Smith Centre for Public Service was created in partnership with the University of Glasgow to promote trust in public service and empower and attract more people to contribute to public life. And in today's climate, I am powerfully reminded both of John's faith in the moral purpose of politics and of his respect for elected politicians. Hilary Armstrong told me that the doctor, filling in John's death certificate, said to Elizabeth, "What should I put?" He was a barrister, wasn't he? And Elizabeth said, "Put politician." John was very proud of being a politician.